My DIL told me my son died skiing in Switzerland. I spent 6 months sleeping on his grave, refusing to believe it. Today, a man touched my shoulder. I turned around, and what I saw shattered my world. I'm glad to have you here. Follow my story until the end, and comment the city you're watching from, so I can see how far my story has reached. The phone rang at 11:47 on a Tuesday morning. I remember the exact time because I was stirring my second cup of coffee, watching the steam curl up from the mug that still said, "World's Best Mom," in faded blue letters. Stuart had given it to me for Mother's Day when he was 12, his gap-toothed grin so proud as he handed over the wrapped gift. I almost didn't answer. Telemarketers had been relentless lately, and at 69, I'd learned to screen my calls. But something made me reach for the receiver. Maybe the persistence of the ring, or the way the morning light was hitting the kitchen window just right, making everything seem too peaceful to last. "Mrs. Hoffman?" The voice was controlled, professional, but there was something underneath it that made my stomach clench. "This is Milena, Stuart's wife." I set down my coffee cup with trembling fingers. In the 7 years since Stuart married Milena, she had never called me directly. Never. All communication went through Stuart, and even that had become sparse over the past few months. "Milena, is everything all right? Is Stuart sick?" The pause stretched too long. I could hear her breathing, deliberate and measured, like she was following a script in her head. "Mrs. Hoffman, I need you to sit down." My legs were already shaking. I sank into the kitchen chair where Stuart used to sit when he visited, back when he still visited. The wood was worn smooth from years of family dinners, Sunday mornings, birthday celebrations. Now it felt cold against my back. "There's been an accident." Her voice was steady, too steady. "Stuart was skiing in Switzerland. There was an avalanche. He didn't make it." The words hit me like physical blows. I heard myself make a sound, something between a gasp and a moan, but it felt like it was coming from someone else. The kitchen spun around me, the yellow wallpaper with its tiny roses blurring into a nauseating kaleidoscope. "No." The word came out as a whisper. "No, that's not possible. Stuart doesn't ski. He's afraid of heights. He always has been since he was little." "He took it up recently," Milena said, and there was an edge in her voice now, impatience creeping through the false sympathy. "He wanted to try new things. You know how he's been lately, wanting to experience life more fully." I didn't know. I didn't know anything about my son wanting to try new things. I didn't know he'd been to Switzerland. I didn't even know he owned skis. "When?" I managed to ask. "When did this happen?" 3 days ago. I've been dealing with arrangements, the authorities. It's been very complicated because we're in a foreign country. 3 days. My son had been dead for 3 days and I was just now finding out. I pressed my hand to my chest, feeling my heart hammering against my ribs like a caged bird. "I want to come. I need to see him." "You can't." The response was immediate, sharp. "The body was too damaged by the avalanche. They're cremating him there. It's Swiss law for cases like this. I'm bringing his ashes home." Something cold crawled up my spine. I'd watched enough crime shows to know that wasn't how international deaths worked. There were procedures, identifications, paperwork that took weeks. "Milena, I don't understand. How did this happen so quickly? Shouldn't there be an investigation? Shouldn't I have been contacted by the authorities?" "You're listed as next of kin after me," she said, and her voice had that patient tone people use when explaining things to children or the elderly. "As his wife, I handle all the legal matters." The Swiss authorities were very efficient. They see these kinds of accidents frequently. I wanted to argue, wanted to demand answers that made sense. But grief was hitting me in waves now, making it hard to think clearly. My baby, my only child, the little boy who used to crawl into my bed during thunderstorms, was gone. The man who called me every Sunday morning to check if I needed anything from the grocery store would never call again. "The funeral will be Saturday," Milena continued. "I've already made the arrangements. Peaceful Valley Cemetery, 2 o'clock. I thought you'd want something simple. Simple. She was planning my son's funeral without me, making decisions about how to say goodbye to the child I'd raised alone after his father died when Stuart was 15. But I couldn't find the words to fight her. The grief was too heavy, pressing down on my chest like a physical weight. I should be helping with the arrangements, I said weakly. I'm his mother. Of course you are, Milena said. But her tone suggested I was stating something obvious rather than asserting my right to be involved. I just thought, given your age and the stress of everything, it would be better if I handled the details. You just need to focus on being there Saturday. My age. As if being 69 made me incapable of planning my own son's funeral. But I didn't have the strength to argue. The shock was settling in now, making everything feel distant and unreal. Can I speak to someone? The authorities in Switzerland? I need to understand what happened. I'll get you the contact information, Milena said, but something in her tone suggested she had no intention of doing so. Right now, I think you should call someone to be with you. This is a terrible shock. After she hung up, I sat in my kitchen for what felt like hours. The coffee had gone cold, the morning light had shifted, and the silence was so complete I could hear the refrigerator humming and the distant sound of children playing in the neighborhood park. Normal sounds of a normal day, as if the world hadn't just ended. I reached into my purse with shaking hands and pulled out Stuart's old baseball glove, the one I'd kept since he outgrew it at 14. I'd carried it with me everywhere for years after his father died, a tangible reminder of happier times. Now I pressed it against my face, breathing in the faint scent of leather and childhood summers, and finally let myself cry. But even through the tears, something nagged at me. Stuart hadn't mentioned any trip to Switzerland. He'd called me just 2 weeks ago, and we'd talked about him coming over to help me plant the spring garden. He'd seemed excited about it, asking what vegetables I wanted to try this year. And the way Milena had delivered the news, so controlled, so prepared with answers for every question. It felt rehearsed, like she'd practiced the conversation. I tried to push the thought away. Grief was making me paranoid, suspicious of my own daughter-in-law. People handled tragedy differently. Maybe efficiency was how she coped with losing her husband. But as I sat there holding my son's childhood glove, I couldn't shake the feeling that something about Milena's call had been very, very wrong. The funeral was exactly what Milena had promised. Simple. Too simple for a man who'd lived 42 years, who'd been loved by more people than the sparse crowd suggested. I counted 37 people in the folding chairs arranged on the artificial grass beside the grave. Most of them were Milena's friends, their faces politely somber but unfamiliar to me. Where were Stuart's college roommates? His co-workers from the accounting firm? The guys from his softball league? I'd expected to see familiar faces, people who would share memories of my son. But instead, I found myself surrounded by strangers offering hollow condolences. Milena sat in the front row, wearing a black Chanel suit that must have cost more than my monthly Social Security check. Her makeup was perfect, her hair styled in an elegant chignon. She dabbed at her eyes with a delicate lace handkerchief, but I noticed something odd. The tears seemed to come and go at convenient moments, appearing when people were watching, disappearing when she thought no one was looking. The minister spoke about Stuart as if he'd never met him, using generic platitudes about a life well lived and a soul at peace. Nothing about Stuart's terrible jokes that always made me laugh despite myself. Nothing about how he volunteered every Christmas at the homeless shelter. Nothing about the way he could fix anything with duct tape and determination. When they lowered the polished casket into the ground, I felt something break inside me that I knew would never heal. But as dirt hit the wood with hollow thuds, I found myself staring at the casket and wondering what was actually inside it. If Stuart had been cremated in Switzerland, as Milena claimed, why were we burying a casket? When I'd asked her about it, she'd said they'd included some of his ashes along with personal items. But something about her explanation felt rehearsed. The reception afterward was held at Milena's new apartment, a place I'd never seen before. It was stark and modern, all white walls and expensive furniture that looked like it had never been used. There were no photos of Stuart anywhere. No evidence that a man had ever lived there, let alone died recently. "It's beautiful," I said to Milena as she guided me through the living room. "When did you move here?" "Last month," she said smoothly. "Stuart wanted something fresh, a new start. This was going to be our dream home." Last month. Stuart had died 3 weeks ago, which meant they'd moved just days before his supposed trip to Switzerland. Why would they sign a lease on an expensive apartment if they were planning an international vacation? The timing made no sense. After the reception, I drove myself home through streets that looked the same, but felt foreign. Everything was exactly as I'd left it that morning, but nothing would ever be the same. Stuart's coffee mug still sat in the dish drainer where I'd left it after his last visit. His jacket hung on the hook by the back door where he'd left it 2 months ago, saying he'd pick it up next time. There wouldn't be a next time. That first night, I didn't sleep. I lay in my bed listening to the house settle around me, feeling the crushing weight of silence where Stuart's Sunday morning phone calls used to be. By morning, I knew what I had to do. I packed a blanket, some snacks, and a thermos of coffee, and drove to Greenwood Cemetery. Section B, Plot 27. The headstone was temporary, a simple granite marker that read, "Stuart James Hoffman, beloved husband," with his birth date, and the date Milena claimed he'd died. No mention that he was also a beloved son. I spread my blanket on the grass beside the grave and sat down. People walking by gave me strange looks, but I didn't care. This was where my son was, and this was where I needed to be. The first week was the hardest. My back ached from sleeping on the ground, and the April nights were still cold enough to make me shiver despite the blanket. Cemetery maintenance workers tried to convince me to go home, explaining that visiting hours ended at sunset. I told them I wasn't visiting. I was keeping vigil. Margaret, my best friend since high school, came by on the 3rd day with a lawn chair and a lecture. "Daphne, honey, this isn't healthy. You need to go home, take a shower, sleep in a real bed." "I can't leave him alone," I said, not taking my eyes off the headstone. "He was always afraid of the dark when he was little. What if he's scared?" Margaret's face softened. She sat beside me on the grass, her 67-year-old knees creaking as she lowered herself down. "Stuart's not here, sweetheart. His soul is somewhere beautiful, somewhere without darkness or fear. This is just earth and stone." But she was wrong. I could feel Stuart here, could sense his presence in the whisper of wind through the oak trees, in the way the morning light hit the granite. He was here, and he needed me. Word of my cemetery vigil spread quickly through our small town. Some people thought I was having a breakdown. Others whispered about the grieving mother who couldn't let go. The local newspaper even ran a story about me, complete with a photo of me sitting beside Stuart's grave with the headline, "Love Knows No Boundaries." Milena showed up on the 10th day, clicking across the cemetery's gravel paths in expensive heels that were completely inappropriate for walking on grass. "Daphne, this has to stop," she said, standing over me with her arms crossed. "People are starting to talk. It's embarrassing." I looked up at her, noting how her makeup was once again perfect, her grief seemingly well managed. Embarrassing to whom? To Stuart's memory, to our family. Do you think this is what he would have wanted? His mother camping out in a cemetery like some kind of vagrant? The word vagrant stung, but I kept my voice level. What I think Stuart would have wanted was for his wife to include his mother in planning his funeral. What I think he would have wanted was for someone to ask me if I needed help instead of telling me to go home because my grief is inconvenient. Milena's jaw tightened. "I'm trying to look out for you. You're making yourself sick with this obsession. This isn't obsession, this is love." She stared at me for a long moment, and something flickered across her face. Not grief, not concern. Something colder. "The insurance company is asking questions," she said finally, "about you camping here. They're wondering if there's something." unstable about the family dynamic. Insurance company. Of course. Stuart's life insurance policy, the one I'd helped him buy 5 years ago when he got married, had a death benefit of $250,000, with Milena as the beneficiary. Are you saying my grief is affecting your insurance claim? I'm saying your behavior is raising red flags. They might think there's something suspicious about Stuart's death if his own mother is acting like she doesn't believe he's really dead. The words hung in the air between us like a challenge, because the truth was, I was beginning to wonder if I did believe he was really dead. Too many things didn't add up. The timing of their move, the rushed funeral, the lack of Stuart's friends, the way Milena had all the answers ready before I even asked the questions. Maybe they should ask questions, I said quietly. Maybe we all should. Milena's face went white, then flushed red. How dare you? How dare you suggest that I'm lying about my husband's death? I lost the love of my life, and instead of supporting me, you're sitting here creating conspiracy theories. But as she turned and walked away, her heels stabbing into the soft earth, I noticed something that made my stomach clench. In the parking lot sat a brand new silver BMW with temporary plates. The same woman who'd told me Stuart had wanted something simple for his funeral was driving a $65,000 car she'd somehow afforded on her part-time receptionist salary. That night, as I lay on my blanket looking up at the stars, I made a decision. Tomorrow I would start asking the questions that Milena clearly didn't want answered, starting with how a woman who'd been crying about funeral expenses could afford a luxury car 3 weeks after her husband's death. It was a Thursday morning in late September when my world turned upside down for the second time. I'd been keeping my vigil at Stuart's grave for 6 months and 12 days. Through scorching summer heat and the first cool whispers of autumn, the cemetery workers had stopped trying to move me along. The other regular visitors had gotten used to seeing me there, some even bringing me coffee or homemade cookies. I was arranging the fresh chrysanthemums I'd brought from my garden when I heard footsteps on the gravel path behind me. Nothing unusual about that, except these footsteps slowed as they approached Stuart's grave, then stopped completely. "Excuse me, ma'am?" I turned to see a man in his 50s, wearing a rumpled brown jacket and carrying a baseball cap in his hands. His face was weathered, lined with the kind of creases that come from spending time outdoors, and his eyes held a gentleness that reminded me of my late husband. "Yes," I said, rising slowly from where I'd been kneeling beside the headstone. My knees protested after 6 months of sleeping on cemetery ground, but I managed to stand without wincing. The man looked from me to the grave, then back to my face with an expression I couldn't quite read. Uncertainty mixed with something that might have been pity. "Are you Mrs. Hoffman, Stuart's mother?" My heart skipped. "Yes, I am. Did you know my son?" He shifted his weight from one foot to the other, clearly struggling with how to say whatever he'd come to say. "Ma'am, I'm not sure how to tell you this, but I think there's something you need to know." The morning air suddenly felt colder. I pulled my cardigan tighter around my shoulders, noting how the man's hands were trembling slightly as he turned his cap over and over in his fingers. "What is it?" I asked, though part of me already sensed that whatever he was about to tell me would shatter what little peace I'd found in my daily routine of grief. "My name is Frank Morrison. I'm a truck driver, long-haul routes mostly. I was at a rest stop outside Phoenix last week when I saw a man who looked exactly like the fellow in that newspaper photo they ran about you." He gestured toward the grave. "The one about the mother who wouldn't leave her son's grave." I stared at him, the words not quite penetrating. "I'm sorry, what did you say?" "Ma'am, I believe I saw your son, alive, at a truck stop in Arizona." The world tilted sideways. I reached out blindly and grabbed Frank's arm to steady myself, feeling the rough fabric of his jacket under my fingers. "That's not possible," I whispered. "Stuart is dead. He died in Switzerland 6 months ago. He's buried right here." Frank's face was grim but determined. "Ma'am, I've been driving trucks for 32 years. I've got a good memory for faces, and I'm telling you, the man I saw looked exactly like your son. Same height, same build, even the same scar on his left hand. The scar. Stuart had cut his hand on a broken mason jar when he was 8, helping me can peaches. The scar was distinctive, a crescent shape that curved from his thumb to his index finger. Only family and close friends would know about it. You saw his scar? My voice came out as barely more than a breath. Clear as day. He was buying coffee, and when he handed the clerk his money, I saw it. That's when I was sure. I'd seen that same scar in the newspaper photo they used when they wrote about you. My legs gave out. I sank down onto the stone bench next to Stuart's grave, my mind reeling. If Frank had seen Stuart alive, then what was in the casket 6 feet below where I'd been sleeping for 6 months? "Ma'am, are you all right?" Frank asked, sitting down beside me. "I know this is a shock, but I had to tell you. After reading about how you've been living here, waiting by his grave, I couldn't keep quiet. Did you talk to him? To the man you think was Stuart?" Frank shook his head. "I tried to, but he saw me looking and got spooked. Took off toward the parking lot like he was running from something." "But ma'am," I followed him. He got into a blue Honda Civic with Arizona plates. I wrote down the license number. He pulled a crumpled piece of paper from his jacket pocket and handed it to me. Written in careful block letters were 7 characters that might as well have been a message from another world. "I already called the Phoenix police," Frank continued. "But they said without proof of a crime, they can't investigate someone for being alive when they're supposed to be dead. That's when I decided to come find you myself." I stared at the license plate number, my hands shaking so badly I could barely hold the paper. If Stuart's alive, then why would everyone think he's dead? Why would his wife tell me he was killed in an avalanche? Frank's expression darkened. "Ma'am, that's exactly what I've been wondering. And there's something else you should know." He reached into his other pocket and pulled out his phone, scrolling through what looked like a photo gallery. "I took this picture at the rest stop before he ran off. The image was grainy, taken from a distance, but it was unmistakably Stuart. Same dark hair, same slight slouch to his shoulders, same way of holding his head when he was worried about something. He looked thinner than I remembered, and there was something haunted in his posture. But it was definitely my son. "Frank," I said, my voice stronger now despite the trembling in my hands. "I need you to help me understand something. If Stuart is alive, then what's in this grave?" Frank looked down at the grass beneath our feet, then back at me with an expression that was equal parts anger and sympathy. "Ma'am, I hate to be the one to tell you this, but I think you need to find out. Because if someone convinced you to bury an empty casket while your son is alive somewhere in Arizona, that's not grief, that's fraud." The word fraud hit me like a physical blow. All those months of sleeping on the cold ground, talking to what I thought was Stuart's grave, crying over an empty box while my son was somewhere in the desert Southwest, possibly in trouble. "Who would do such a thing?" I whispered, though even as I asked the question, I knew the answer. Only one person had controlled every aspect of Stuart's death story. Only one person had rushed the funeral, refused to let me see the body, and insisted on immediate cremation in Switzerland. "Ma'am, I don't like to speak ill of anyone, but from what I've read in the papers about your situation, it seems to me like someone wanted you to think your son was dead. The question is why?" I thought about Milena's new BMW, her expensive apartment, the life insurance policy worth $250,000. I thought about how quickly she'd had answers for all my questions, how she'd tried to keep me away from the funeral arrangements, how she'd seemed more annoyed than grieved by my vigil at the cemetery. "Frank, I need to ask you to do something for me," I said, standing up with a determination I hadn't felt in months. "I need you to help me find out what's really in this grave." He stood too, his weathered face set with resolve. "Ma'am, I was hoping you'd say that, because a mother has a right to know if she's been lied to about her own child's death." As we walked away from the grave together, leaving behind the flowers I'd brought and the blanket I'd slept on for so many nights. I felt something I hadn't experienced since that terrible phone call 6 months ago. Hope. Terrifying, dangerous hope that maybe my son was still alive somewhere under the Arizona sky. But with that hope came a cold fury unlike anything I'd ever experienced. If Stuart was alive, if Milena had orchestrated this elaborate deception, then she hadn't just stolen insurance money. She'd stolen 6 months of my life, 6 months of believing my child was dead, 6 months of the deepest grief a mother can experience, and I was going to make sure she paid for every single day of it. Getting permission to exhume a grave is not something they teach you in parenting books. It requires lawyers, court orders, and more paperwork than I'd filled out in my entire 69 years of life. But Frank Morrison proved to be exactly the kind of ally I needed. He had connections, a cousin who worked in the county coroner's office, and most importantly, he had the photograph of Stuart at the Arizona rest stop. It took 3 weeks to get the court order. 3 weeks of sleepless nights, of poring over legal documents I barely understood, of spending money I couldn't really afford on a lawyer who specialized in cases involving insurance fraud. 3 weeks of Milena calling me increasingly frantic voicemails, demanding to know why I was disturbing Stuart's rest. The exhumation was scheduled for a gray October morning when the first frost had already killed my garden flowers. I stood at the edge of Section B, Plot 27, watching the cemetery workers carefully remove the headstone that had become as familiar to me as my own front door. Frank stood beside me, along with my lawyer, a sharp-eyed woman named Patricia Hendricks who'd taken my case on contingency. Detective Ray Morrison from the county sheriff's department was there too, having been assigned to investigate once the court order revealed potential fraud. "You sure you want to be here for this, Mrs. Hoffman?" Detective Morrison asked, his voice gentle but concerned. "It might be better if you waited in the car until we know what we're dealing with." I shook my head. "I've been sleeping on this ground for 6 months. I need to see what's down there." The backhoe operator worked slowly, carefully, peeling away layers of earth that had been my ceiling all through the long summer nights. With each scoop of dirt, my heart hammered harder against my ribs. Part of me still hoped we'd find Stuart's body, that this had all been some terrible misunderstanding. But a larger part of me, the part that had noticed all the inconsistencies from the beginning, knew we were about to uncover something much worse than death. When they finally reached the casket, it took 4 men to lift it out of the ground. Even from a distance, something looked wrong. The casket was too light, shifting too easily in their hands. Detective Morrison used a crowbar to pry open the lid while we all held our breath. The casket was empty except for a handful of cremation ashes in a small urn and a few personal items I recognized as Stuart's. His watch, the one his father had given him for his 18th birthday. A photo of us from his college graduation. His high school class ring. "Jesus Christ," Detective Morrison muttered under his breath. Then, looking up at me with a mixture of anger and sympathy, he said, "Mrs. Hoffman, I'm sorry to tell you this, but you've been burying personal effects, not your son." I stared down at the pathetic collection of items that had supposedly represented my child's earthly remains. The ashes couldn't have weighed more than a few pounds, barely enough to represent a small dog, let alone a full-grown man. "Where did these ashes come from?" I asked, my voice surprisingly steady. "We'll have them tested," the detective said, "but my guess is they're either animal remains or they came from a crematorium's unclaimed ash pile. Someone wanted to make the casket feel like it had weight when it was carried." Patricia Hendricks was already on her phone, presumably calling someone about the legal implications of what we'd discovered. Frank had his arm around my shoulders, steadying me as the full magnitude of the deception sank in. "Mrs. Hoffman," Detective Morrison said, closing his notebook and looking at me directly, "I need you to tell me everything you remember about your daughter-in-law's behavior after she informed you of your son's death. Every detail, no matter how small." We spent the next 2 hours in the cemetery office, going through every conversation I'd had with Milena, every inconsistency I'd noticed, every moment when her grief had seemed rehearsed rather than genuine. As I talked, Detective Morrison filled page after page in his notebook, occasionally asking me to repeat details or clarify timelines. "The insurance money," he said finally. "Do you know if she's received it yet?" I thought back to Milena's new BMW, her expensive apartment, the designer clothes she'd worn to the funeral. Based on her spending, I'd say yes. That's going to be a problem for her. Insurance fraud is a felony, especially when it involves this much money. But Mrs. Hoffman, there's something else we need to discuss. If your son is alive, why hasn't he contacted you? Why is he hiding in Arizona under what appears to be an assumed identity? The question I'd been dreading, because if Stuart was alive and hadn't reached out to me in 6 months, it meant one of two things. Either he was being held against his will, or he believed he had a reason to stay hidden from his own family. "Detective Morrison, I need to ask you something," I said, leaning forward in my chair. "Is it possible that Stuart doesn't know I think he's dead? Is it possible that Milena convinced him of some other story to explain why he had to disappear?" The detective's eyebrows rose. "What are you thinking?" "I'm thinking about how controlled she was when she called to tell me about the accident. How she had answers ready for every question. What if she didn't just lie to me? What if she lied to Stuart, too?" That afternoon, Detective Morrison and I went to Milena's apartment. The same stark white space where she'd held Stuart's reception, though now it felt more like a crime scene than a home. Milena answered the door wearing yoga clothes and an expression of carefully crafted concern. "Daphne, what a surprise! Is everything all right? You look terrible." Detective Morrison showed his badge. "Mrs. Hoffman, I'm Detective Morrison with the County Sheriff's Department. We need to talk to you about your husband's death." I watched Milena's face carefully, looking for the micro-expressions my grief had made me miss before. The brief flash of panic before her features settled into confused innocence. The way her hand gripped the doorframe just a little too tightly. "Of course," she said. "Please come in, though I'm not sure what more I can tell you. Stuart died in Switzerland, and I've already provided all the documentation to the insurance company." "That's interesting," Detective Morrison said, settling onto her white leather couch. "Because we just exhumed your husband's casket this morning. Care to explain why it was empty except for a few pounds of unidentified ashes?" The color drained from Milena's face so quickly I thought she might faint. She sat down heavily in the chair across from us, her hands shaking as she reached for a glass of water on the side table. "I don't understand," she said, but her voice lacked conviction. "The Swiss authorities told me they were sending his remains." "Mrs. Hoffman," Detective Morrison continued, his voice taking on a harder edge, "we have reason to believe your husband is alive and living in Arizona. We have photographic evidence and witness testimony placing him at a truck stop outside Phoenix last week." Milena's carefully maintained composure cracked completely. She buried her face in her hands and began to sob, but these tears were different from the ones I'd seen at the funeral. These were tears of fear, not grief. "I never meant for it to go this far," she whispered through her fingers. "It was supposed to be temporary, just until he got his head straight." "What was supposed to be temporary?" I asked, my voice cold with controlled rage. Milena looked up at me with red-rimmed eyes. "Stuart was having problems, mental health problems. He was talking about leaving me, about starting over somewhere else. He said he felt trapped." "So you convinced him to fake his death?" Detective Morrison's voice carried decades of experience with criminals and their justifications. "I convinced him to disappear for a while," Milena said. "I told him if he could just go away for 6 months, get some help, figure out what he really wanted, then we could work things out. I said I'd tell everyone he was traveling, that he needed space." "But you didn't tell everyone he was traveling," I said, standing up slowly, feeling the anger build in my chest like a rising tide. "You told me he was dead. You let me grieve for 6 months. You let me sleep on his empty grave." "I panicked," Milena sobbed. "When Stuart left, I realized how much debt we had, how much money we needed. The life insurance seemed like the only way out. I thought if I could just get the money, then when Stuart came back, we could pay everything off and start fresh. And Stuart agreed to this plan? Detective Morrison asked. Milena's silence stretched too long. Finally, she shook her head. Stuart thinks his mother rejected him. I told him you said you never wanted to see him again, that you blamed him for his father's death, that you were better off without him in your life. The room went completely silent, except for the sound of my heart breaking all over again. Not because Stuart was dead, but because for 6 months, my son had believed that his own mother had rejected him. While I was sleeping on what I thought was his grave, mourning his loss, he was somewhere in the Arizona desert believing I had thrown him away. Mrs. Hoffman, Detective Morrison said to Milena, you're under arrest for insurance fraud, filing false reports, and conspiracy to commit fraud. As the detective read Milena her rights, I sat back down on the white leather couch and tried to process the magnitude of what she had done. She hadn't just stolen money. She had stolen 6 months of my life and 6 months of my son's life. She had weaponized our love for each other, turning it into a tool for her own greed. But Stuart was alive. My boy was alive somewhere under the vast Arizona sky. And now I had to figure out how to find him and convince him that everything his wife had told him was a lie. Finding Stuart took another 2 weeks. Detective Morrison worked with Arizona authorities to track down the blue Honda Civic with the license plate Frank had written down. They found it registered under the name James Stewart at a small motel outside of Tucson, a name so obviously fake it broke my heart to think of my brilliant son reduced to such a transparent alias. I flew to Arizona on a Tuesday morning in early November, my first time on an airplane in over 20 years. Frank Morrison insisted on coming with me, saying he'd started this journey and intended to see it through. Detective Morrison arranged for local police to be present in case Stuart tried to run again or if there were complications we hadn't anticipated. The Cactus Inn was exactly the kind of place where people went to disappear. A single-story building painted the color of desert sand, with numbered doors facing a parking lot full of vehicles that had seen better days. The air smelled of hot asphalt and creosote, and the temperature was already climbing toward 90 degrees, even though it was November. Room 14, Detective Morrison said, checking his notes. He's been registered there for 3 months, paying weekly in cash. The manager says he's quiet, keeps to himself, works odd jobs around town. My hands were shaking as we walked down the concrete walkway toward room 14. 3 months meant Stuart had been here since August, which meant he'd moved to Arizona shortly after Milena claimed he'd died in Switzerland. The timeline of her deception was becoming clearer, but that didn't make it any easier to understand how she'd convinced my son to abandon his entire life. Frank squeezed my shoulder gently. You ready for this, Mrs. Hoffman? I nodded, though I wasn't sure anyone could be ready for confronting their supposedly dead child. Detective Morrison knocked on the door, a firm but not aggressive rap of knuckles against painted wood. James Stewart? Police. We need to talk to you. There was silence, then the sound of movement inside the room. Footsteps approached the door, hesitated, then stopped completely. Stewart? I called out, my voice breaking on his name. Stewart, it's Mom. The silence that followed felt like it lasted forever. Then, slowly, I heard the chain lock being undone, the deadbolt turning, the door handle clicking. The door opened just a crack, and I saw one brown eye peering out, the same brown eye that had looked up at me when he was 5 years old and afraid of monsters in his closet. Mom? His voice was hoarse, uncertain, like he was seeing a ghost. Yes, baby, it's me. The door opened wider, and I got my first full look at my son in 7 months. He was thinner than I remembered, his face gaunt and shadowed with stubble. His hair was longer and unkempt, and his clothes looked like they'd come from a thrift store. But it was definitely Stuart, my boy, alive and breathing and standing right in front of me. For a moment, neither of us moved. Then Stuart stepped back, his expression shifting from shock to something that looked almost like fear. "What are you doing here? How did you find me?" "Stuart, we need to talk," Detective Morrison said gently. "There are some things you need to know about your wife." Stuart's face hardened. "Milena told me you'd try this eventually. She said you'd hire investigators, try to drag me back into a life I didn't want. I told her I was done, that I needed to start over, and she supported that decision." I felt my heart breaking all over again. "Stuart, what exactly did Milena tell you about me?" He ran his hands through his hair, a gesture I remembered from his childhood when he was upset about something. "She told me you said I was a disappointment, that you blamed me for Dad's death because I wasn't there when he had his heart attack. She said you told her you were better off without me, that watching me struggle with depression was too much for you to handle." Each word was like a physical blow. I stepped forward, reaching out to touch his face, but he flinched away from me. "Stuart, none of that is true. Not one word of it." "Then why didn't you try to contact me when I left? Why didn't you call or text or come looking for me?" Frank stepped forward, his weathered face gentle but determined. "Son, your mother didn't try to contact you because she thought you were dead. Your wife told her you died in a skiing accident in Switzerland. She's been grieving you for 6 months." Stuart stared at Frank as if he'd spoken in a foreign language. "What did you say?" "Your wife collected $250,000 in life insurance money," Detective Morrison added. "She held a funeral for you. Your mother has been sleeping at your grave every night for 6 months, believing you were buried there." The color drained from Stuart's face. He stumbled backward and sat down heavily on the bed, his head in his hands. "That's not possible," he whispered. "Milena wouldn't do that. She's the only person who understood what I was going through, who supported my decision to disappear and start fresh." I sat down beside him on the bed, fighting the urge to pull him into my arms. "Stuart, I need you to tell me exactly what happened when you left. Every detail." He was quiet for a long time, staring at his hands. When he finally spoke, his voice was so soft I had to strain to hear him. "I was having panic attacks," he said. "Bad ones. About work, about money, about feeling trapped in a life that didn't feel like mine. I told Milena I thought about leaving sometimes, just driving away and starting over somewhere else. She said she understood, that maybe some time apart would be good for both of us. And then what happened? She suggested I actually do it. Take some money from our savings, buy a car with cash, drive somewhere far away and just be nobody for a while. She said she'd tell people I was traveling, that I needed space to figure things out. She promised she'd handle everything at home while I got my head straight." My heart was pounding. "Stuart, did you ever tell her to tell me you were dead?" "No!" His head shot up, his eyes wide with horror. "God, no. I asked her to tell you I was traveling, maybe visiting friends in California. I didn't want you to worry, but I never wanted you to think I was dead." Detective Morrison leaned against the doorframe, his expression grim. "Mr. Hoffman, your wife cashed in your life insurance policy 3 days after you left. She told your mother you died in an avalanche in Switzerland. She held a funeral and buried an empty casket." Stuart stood up abruptly, pacing to the small window that looked out over the parking lot. "She's been texting me," he said, his voice getting stronger with anger. "Sending me updates about how you were doing. She said you were relieved that I was gone, that you'd started dating someone new, that you'd moved into a smaller apartment because you didn't want to be reminded of me." I felt sick. "Stuart, I haven't dated anyone since your father died 12 years ago. I'm still in the same house you grew up in. And I've been sleeping on what I thought was your grave every single night, talking to a headstone with your name on it." He turned back to face me, and I could see the exact moment when the full horror of what Milena had done hit him. His face went white, then red with rage. "She kept us apart on purpose," he whispered. "She made us both think the other person had given up." "Stuart, there's more," Detective Morrison said gently. "Your wife has been arrested for insurance fraud. She spent the life insurance money on a new car, a luxury apartment, and expensive clothes. She's been living as a wealthy widow while you've been hiding in a desert motel believing your mother rejected you. Stuart sank back down onto the bed, his whole body shaking. I've been sending her postcards, he said, his voice broken, telling her about the jobs I've been working, the people I've met, asking her to tell you I was okay, that I still loved you but needed time. She's been lying to both of us for 6 months. I couldn't hold back anymore. I reached for him, and this time he didn't pull away. He collapsed against me, 42 years old but feeling like my little boy again, and we both cried for everything Milena had stolen from us. 6 months of grief, 6 months of believing we'd lost each other, 6 months of living with lies that had poisoned our love and turned it into a weapon. I'm so sorry, Mom, he sobbed against my shoulder. I'm so sorry I believed her. I should have known you would never say those things about me. You don't have anything to apologize for, I whispered, stroking his hair the way I had when he was small and had nightmares. She manipulated both of us. She used our love for each other against us. As we held each other in that shabby motel room, I realized that Milena's greatest mistake had been believing that the bond between a mother and son could be permanently severed by lies. She'd succeeded in separating us physically, in making us both suffer. But she'd never understood that some love is too strong to destroy. Now we had to figure out how to rebuild what she had torn apart, and make sure she paid for every day of pain she had caused. Stuart and I returned to Phoenix together 3 days later. He'd spent those days in Arizona packing up his few possessions from the motel room and legally reclaiming his identity. The process was surprisingly simple, involving a trip to the Social Security office and some paperwork to restore his name and status as a living person. The hardest part was calling his employer to explain that he hadn't actually died 6 months ago and would like his job back. During the flight home, Stuart told me about his months in hiding. How he'd worked construction jobs for cash, lived on fast food and cheap coffee, slept in a bed with sheets he washed in the motel sink. How he'd called the house twice but hung up when Milena answered, because she'd convinced him I didn't want to hear from him. How he'd written letter after letter to me that he'd never sent, because he believed I'd thrown him away. The worst part, he said, staring out the airplane window at the desert landscape below, was missing Dad's birthday in August. I sat in that motel room all day, thinking about how disappointed you must be that neither of your men was there to help you put flowers on his grave. I reached over and took his hand, noting how thin and rough it had become from manual labor. I put flowers there for both of you that day. I told your father that you were traveling, but that you loved him. Stuart squeezed my fingers. She really had us convinced, didn't she? That we didn't need each other anymore. The preliminary hearing was scheduled for the following Tuesday. Stuart and I sat in the front row of the courtroom, watching as Milena was led in wearing Orange County jail scrubs instead of her usual designer clothes. Her hair was pulled back in a messy ponytail, and without her careful makeup, she looked older, smaller, more ordinary. She saw Stuart and stopped walking so abruptly that the bailiff had to steady her. For a moment, her mask of composed grief slipped completely, and I saw the calculation in her eyes as she tried to figure out how to spin this new development to her advantage. "Stuart," she called out, her voice carrying that same syrupy tone she'd used when she called to tell me he was dead. "Thank God you're okay. I was so worried when you stopped responding to my messages." Stuart stood up slowly, and when he spoke, his voice was steady and cold. "You mean the messages where you told me my mother had rejected me? Or the messages where you asked me not to contact home because it would be too painful for everyone?" Milena's court-appointed lawyer whispered something urgent in her ear, but she ignored him. "Stuart, you have to understand. I was trying to protect you. Your mother was saying terrible things about you after you left, blaming you for all kinds of problems. I thought it would be easier if you just stayed away until things calmed down." "That's interesting," Stuart said, his voice getting louder. "Because my mother was sleeping on my grave every night, believing you when you told her I was dead. For the first time since I'd known her, Milena seemed genuinely shocked. Her mouth opened and closed like she was trying to speak, but no sound came out. The prosecutor, a sharp-eyed woman named Janet Williams, had built an airtight case. She presented bank records showing the life insurance payment and how it had been spent. She had the fake death certificate Milena had created using online templates. She had testimony from the cemetery workers about my months-long vigil at the empty grave. Most damning of all, she had phone records showing that Milena had been in contact with Stewart throughout his time in Arizona, even while collecting insurance money for his supposed death. "Your Honor," the prosecutor said during her closing argument, "this wasn't a crime of passion or desperation. This was a calculated scheme to defraud an insurance company while emotionally torturing both the victim and his mother. The defendant systematically destroyed a family relationship in order to line her own pockets." Milena's lawyer tried to argue that she'd been overwhelmed by her husband's mental health crisis, that she'd made poor decisions under stress. But the evidence was overwhelming. You can't accidentally file insurance claims for someone you know is alive. You can't mistakenly hold a funeral for a living person. You can't inadvertently spend months lying to both a mother and son about each other's feelings. The judge sentenced her to 5 years in prison for insurance fraud, plus restitution of the full insurance amount plus penalties, totaling $315,000. She would also face federal charges for mail fraud related to the fake death certificate. As she was led away in handcuffs, Milena turned one last time to look at Stewart. "I loved you," she called out, her voice breaking. "Everything I did because I loved you." Stewart stood up and walked to the barrier separating the gallery from the defendant's table. "If you loved me," he said, his voice carrying clearly through the silent courtroom, "you wouldn't have made my mother sleep on an empty grave for 6 months believing I was dead." That evening, Stewart and I sat in my kitchen, the same kitchen where I'd received Milena's devastating phone call 8 months earlier. But now Stewart was across from me at the table, drinking coffee from his old mug, the one I'd kept in the dish drainer all those months like a shrine to his memory. "I need to ask you something," he said, turning the mug in his hands. "Were you really sleeping at the cemetery every night?" I nodded. "Every single night. I brought blankets, snacks, a thermos of coffee. I talked to your headstone about my day, about memories of you growing up, about how much I missed you." Stewart was quiet for a long time, staring into his coffee. I can't imagine how that must have felt, believing I was gone forever. "It was the worst pain I've ever experienced," I admitted. "Worse than losing your father, because at least when he died, I got to say goodbye. With you, I kept thinking about all the things I'd never told you, all the conversations we'd never have." "What kinds of things?" I reached across the table and covered his hand with mine. "How proud I am of you. How you've been the best thing in my life since the day you were born. How even during your worst struggles with depression and anxiety, you never stopped being kind to other people. How you call to check on me every Sunday. How you always offer to help with things around the house even though you have your own life to worry about." Stewart's eyes filled with tears. "Milena convinced me that you saw me as a burden, that my depression exhausted you, that you were tired of worrying about me." "Stewart, worrying about you isn't a burden. It's what mothers do. It's how we show love." We talked until nearly midnight, filling in the gaps that Milena's lies had created. Stewart told me about the panic attacks that had made him feel like he was suffocating in his own life. I told him about the nights I'd lain awake at the cemetery, certain I could feel his presence in the wind through the oak trees. "I want to see it," he said finally. "The grave. I need to understand what you went through." The next morning, we drove to Greenwood Cemetery together. Section B, Plot 27 looked different in the daylight with Stewart beside me. The headstone was gone, removed as evidence in the criminal case. All that remained was a rectangle of bare earth and the oak tree I'd slept under for so many nights. Stewart knelt down and touched the soil where his fake grave had been. "You really slept here?" "Right here," I said, pointing to a spot beside where the headstone had been. I brought the blue blanket from your childhood bedroom and made myself a little nest between your grave and the tree. He looked up at me with an expression of wonder and heartbreak. Mom, I am so sorry. Not just for believing Milena's lies, but for putting you in a position where you felt like sleeping on the ground was the only way to be close to me. You don't need to apologize for her choices, I said firmly. She manipulated both of us. She weaponized our love for each other. Stuart stood up and brushed the dirt off his knees. What happens now? Do we try to pretend the last 8 months never happened? I thought about that for a moment, looking around the cemetery where I'd spent so many hours talking to what I thought was my dead son. I don't think we can pretend it never happened. But maybe we can learn from it. Maybe we can be more direct with each other about our feelings, more honest about our struggles. I should have called you when I was having panic attacks, Stuart said, instead of just talking to Milena about them. And I should have trusted my instincts when her story didn't add up, I replied. But Stuart, there's something else I need you to know. Even in my deepest grief, even when I thought you were gone forever, I was still proud to be your mother. Sleeping on your grave wasn't just about loss. It was about love that death couldn't touch. We stood there for a while in the morning sunshine, two people who had been torn apart by lies and manipulation, but had found their way back to each other. In the distance, I could see the cemetery workers going about their daily tasks, mowing grass and tending to the flowers that marked real graves, holding real loved ones. 6 months later, Stuart moved back into his old bedroom in my house. Not because he couldn't afford his own place, but because we'd both learned how precious our time together was. He went back to work at his old job, resumed his Sunday phone calls even though we now talked every day, and started seeing a therapist to work through the trauma of Milena's psychological manipulation. I stopped carrying his childhood baseball glove in my purse and hung it on the wall in his room instead, where it belonged. We planted a garden together that spring, the one we'd planned to plant during our last phone conversation before Milena destroyed our lives. And every year on the anniversary of the day Frank Morrison tapped me on the shoulder at the cemetery, we go back to Section B, Plot 27, not to mourn, but to remember how love had been strong enough to survive even the cruelest deception. Now I'm curious about you who listened to my story. What would you do if you were in my place? Have you ever been through something similar? Comment below, and meanwhile, I'm leaving on the final screen 2 other stories that are channel favorites, and they will definitely surprise you. Thank you for watching until here.